Hey everyone, welcome. Today we're going to dive into a way of life that's ancient, incredibly resilient, and, well, it's lived in this perfect rhythm with the planet. We're talking about a world that is constantly in motion. I want you to just stop and think about that for a second. Seriously, what if your home, your job, your entire community, what if it didn't stay put? What if instead you just followed the rains, the melting snow, the new grass? For most of us living our settled lives, that's a pretty wild thought. But for millions of people all around the globe, this isn't some hypothetical question. It's a real, deeply logical, and sustainable way of life that's been thriving for centuries, often in some of the toughest environments on Earth. So what are we talking about here exactly? We're talking about pastoral nomads. At its core, these are communities whose entire lives revolve around their animals. They don't really have a fixed address in the way we think about it. Instead, they're always migrating, following these ancient cycles to make sure their herds have fresh grazing lands and water. It's a life of constant and really purposeful motion. Right, and this movement, it is not random at all. It's actually a brilliant strategy, almost like a dance with the environment. Their calendars aren't really marked by months and days, but by the first snowfall or the arrival of the monsoon rains. And this slide right here, it just lays out the two main patterns of this movement so perfectly. On one hand, you've got the mountain communities. For them, the cycle is vertical. They move down to the lower hills during the winter to get away from the heavy snow. And then, come summer, they make the long journey back up to these beautiful high meadows. Then, on the other hand, you have folks on the plateaus and plains. Their movement is horizontal. They follow the monsoon rains, moving between wet and dry regions to find good pasture. It's two totally different environments, but two equally brilliant adaptations. Okay, so let's make this real. In the mountains of Jammu and Kashmir, you've got the Gujjar Bakarals. We're talking entire families traveling together in these big caravans they call a kafala. When winter sets in, they head down to the lower hills. And then, around April, they start that long march all the way back up, crossing these really treacherous mountain passes to get to their summer meadows. The Gaddis and the Gujjars, they follow very similar cycles, all dictated by that rhythm of the snow. And then out on the plateaus, you have communities like the Dhangars of Maharashtra. During the dry season, they'd make their way to the coastal Konkan region. And this is just a perfect example of the symbiotic relationships they built. The Konkan farmers would actually welcome the Dhangars because their herds would eat the leftover stubble from the harvest and, this is the crucial part, manure the fields for the next crop. In return, the farmers would give the herders rice to take back home. It was a total win-win. Everybody benefited. So for centuries, this way of life just worked. It was in balance. But then, a massive disruption came along, the arrival of colonial rule. And this wasn't just a change in who was in charge, it was a fundamental clash of two completely different ways of seeing the world. See, to a pastoralist, land wasn't really something you owned. It was a communal resource, a lifeline for everyone. The whole idea was to use it, let it recover, and then move on. You had to make sure it would be there for you next year and for the next generation. It was all about sustainability and mobility. But the colonial administrators, they saw things very, very differently. To them, any land that wasn't being permanently farmed and wasn't generating a fixed tax revenue, well, they just called it wasteland. It was seen as totally unproductive. Their big goal was to settle these mobile people, to control them, tax them, and turn all these vast grazing lands into taxable farms. And this wasn't just an attitude, it was enforced with a wave of new laws. First, starting in the mid-1800s, you get the Forest Acts. These declared huge areas of forest as reserved, which meant traditional grazing grounds were suddenly off-limits. Then, in 1871, comes the absolutely shocking Criminal Tribes Act, which literally branded entire mobile communities as criminal by nature just because they moved around and were hard to control. And at the exact same time in Africa, European powers were busy carving up the continent, drawing these arbitrary borders that sliced right through ancient migration routes. The impact of all these policies was, as you can imagine, immediate and absolutely devastating. For pastoralists, whether they were in India or Africa, their whole world suddenly began to shrink. I mean, just look at the Maasai in East Africa. Before colonial rule, their territory was enormous. After, they lost an astonishing 60% of their land. 60%. And to make it even worse, their best grazing lands, the areas with the most water, were taken for white settlement or turned into national parks, like the famous Serengeti. And here's the final cruel irony. The Maasai were then banned from even entering these reserves to graze their own cattle. So this became the new reality pretty much everywhere. Grazing lands just vanished. Their movement was now controlled by permits and borders. There were new taxes on everything, on land, on water, even on every single animal they owned. Pastoralists were pushed onto the driest, most fragile lands. And of course, this forced them to graze their animals intensely on tiny patches of land, which degraded the environment and basically dismantled their entire way of life. But this is not just a story of loss. It's also a story of incredible resilience. Because even when faced with these immense pressures, pastoral communities found ways to adapt and survive. So how did they cope with all this? Well, some had to reduce the number of animals in their herds, just to match the smaller pastures. Others changed their traditional routes entirely, finding new places to graze. A lot of them started combining herding with other things, like farming a small plot of land or getting into trade. And yeah, for some, the pressures were just too great, and they were forced to give up the pastoral life altogether and settle down as laborers in farms or cities. And this brings us to a really fascinating modern twist. You see, for decades, pastoralism was seen as this backward, inefficient thing. But today, many ecologists now argue that this mobile way of life is actually one of the most ecologically sound and sustainable ways to use dry and semi-arid lands. It prevents overuse of resources and keeps fragile ecosystems healthy. Which kind of leaves us with a final big thought, doesn't it? In our modern world, a world so obsessed with property lines and fixed addresses and national borders, what wisdom have we lost by pushing this life of motion to the very margins? What can we maybe learn from a worldview that sees the earth not as something to be owned, but as a shared home to be carefully navigated? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for watching.